Well, welcome and good morning to Elevenses. Hopefully the music didn't come over too stuttery. Bit of a surprise because I'm actually recording this show this morning. So it's not going out live, so I can't answer any questions on air. I am somewhere between London and Lincolnshire as this goes out. But we have something very special for you this morning. We have an in-depth look at the state of play of the electric motorcycle market. As Honda released their WN7 e-moto last week, I ask where we are now and I take a look at the road ahead. So grab yourselves a brew, pull up a chair and stay with me as I take you through my look at where I think the electric motorcycle market is over the next 40 minutes or so. Now, the reason for putting this show together today really is that we have seen something of a revolution on four wheels, but on two, well, you know, if you have been following Elevenses since 2020, I've been following the development of the sort of the electrically propelled two-wheeler with considerable interest and some enthusiasm too. But it's fair to say that whilst electric cars have seen a huge boost in sales over the last 5 years, Teslas, for example, here in London have gone from "Ooh, look" to "yawn." Electric motorcycles have so far failed to make a major impact here in the UK. In fact, just the other week I reported on the fact I'd actually seen a Maving in use. Now, with climate goals, ICE bans just a decade away, why is that? Does the UK represent the global situation? Is the e-moto an unstoppable force, or is it still searching for its soul? And just a reminder before I launch into trying to answer those questions for you, I'm not an industry guy, I'm not a fanboy, I'm just a long-time motorcycle rider who has always had a fascination with new technology. Sometimes I've adopted it too. But there may be industry insights that I'm not aware of or that I gloss over in my ignorance. But I'm telling you the story as I see it from the perspective of a potential future owner, someone who is enthusiastic about the potentiality of electric motorcycles, but also someone who's yet to be tipped over the edge of seeing solid reasons for going out and buying one tomorrow. So let's start with the first segment of this particular show, the market reality. Let's look at the big picture. Now, global sales are currently niche, but they are growing, and the more markets forecasts are projecting strong growth. Analysts are predicting a significant rise in electric scooter and motorcycle sales by 2030. Now, on paper, this all sounds very promising, but there are some issues. Adoption is regional, and the numbers are currently dominated by low performance motorcycles and scooters. Now, in emerging markets in Asia, Vietnam, I've talked about recently, India, China are other examples, the numbers of electric motorcycles on the streets are still dwarfed by the numbers of ICE motorcycles out there. But there has been a relatively high uptake of affordable electric motorcycles for urban mobility and congestion busting, but also to comply with air quality rules. And we've talked about the new law that will be introduced in Vietnam, in Hanoi, for example. India has also seen particularly heavy investment in e-motorcycle construction. I seem to remember reporting that the largest factory in the world dedicated to electric motorcycles is in India. But also, somewhat perhaps to the surprise of many, the emerging markets in Africa, Uganda, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Kenya are all examples of places where there are projects to transition commercial taxi motos, the sort of the boda bodas, to electric motorcycles by using battery swapping technology in many cases, and inexpensive electric motorcycles. Now, in Europe, we're seeing relatively slow uptake. It's held back, experts say, by the cost, by the infrastructure, and by a lack of compelling mid-market models. And in fact, sales are down significantly since their 2022 peak, which is a big disappointment. Having said that, of course, all other motorcycles, the sales are down too. So, in context, electric bikes haven't performed that badly. In the US, there is a slightly different situation. They've seen some enthusiastic niche adoption because they're often framed as luxury sort of tech toys. And if you've got the cash to blow, then those bikes have been selling at least in you know some numbers. But it does seem that the hype around electric motorcycles isn't translating into widespread take up in the key European and Western markets generally. And the results paint a sort of fairly bleak picture of a wave of high profile failures amongst electric startups. Companies like Energica, Arc, Cake, Fuel, they've all struggled between 2023 and 2024. Talk about some of those in a moment. Even Harley Davidson's electric offshoot Livewire has faced significant losses in early 2025, with sales not showing the levels that they were hoping for. So, what is it behind this split level reality? Well, it's partly a question of geography, it's partly a question of economics, it's partly a question of culture. So, let's try to unpack what's going on. So, there is something of a tug of war between legislation and lobbyists. Now, were the Earth not heating up, if the ever growing cities on this planet were not being blanketed in smog, and if oil resources were not finite, the case for the ICE is strong. It might run pretty much forever. It's cheap, it's simple to build, all the wrinkles have been ironed out, and it can be scaled to fit anything from a single seat scooter to a sort of a 250,000 ton cargo ship. But environmental realities drive the push towards decarbonisation. The targets set by many countries will phase out sales of new ICE cars and vans. The precise timing varies. 2030 is the target for some countries, 2035 is more frequent. And the EU, through its Fit for 55 package, calls for all new cars and light commercial vehicles to have zero CO2 emissions at the tailpipe by 2035. Now, so far, the decarbonisation policy spotlight has fallen rather less clearly on two and three wheelers, but the EU and the UK now do have an end of life date for motorcycles, and even existing ICE machines may face regulatory bans or at least very tight limits in certain cities. We already have, of course, the ULEZ zone here in London, and those measures are spreading. Now, worldwide, projections expect that in large markets like China, almost all new sales of two-wheelers will be electric within the next 10 years or so. But this has caused something of a split in rider advocacy groups, because the European Federation of Motorcycle Associations, that's FEMA, they've actually entered into an agreement with the manufacturers group, ASEM, the who support decarbonisation goals. And the UK's MCIA, that's the UK Industry Association, they have also supported the use of small electric motorcycles. Now, as a result of this, the UK's Motorcycle Action Group, MAG, they pulled out of FEMA in 2024, representing the decision to pursue electric motorcycles, at least for small commuter bikes, as a gutless betrayal of rider interests. And they continue to position themselves as opposed to forced electrification, as they call it. MAG's position is clear. Electric motorcycles have a role, but the market, not politicians, should decide their significance. So, moving on. To the third topic, sales beget products, beget sales. Now, at the end of the day, electric motorcycles will only succeed if somebody builds them and if somebody else is willing to buy them. Now, both of these steps depend entirely on confidence. For the manufacturers, it's confidence that the market will be big enough to justify the risk of investing in new factories, in new tooling, in developing the supply chains necessary. If they think demand will fizzle out, they'll drag their feet. They're likely to stick to the ICE engine, and they're likely to hope that regulation gets delayed. Now, for riders, it's confidence that the bike they buy today won't be orphaned tomorrow, that it will hold its value, that there will be spare parts, there will be service networks, and there will be a charging infrastructure on which to um, plug it in. So this confidence is contagious. Now, governments can set their firm phase-out dates for ICE, and that may create a sense of inevitability that the market for electric motorcycles will exist, but it's still seen largely as something for the future. Even the government is still talking in terms of how much money they will put up to install electric charging points at some point in the future. But that future now is getting closer and closer. It's only when the manufacturers and the governments actually step up to do something real that it will signal to riders that electric bikes are not just something for the future, but are coming. And what we need more than anything is something that is visible here and now. So if a manufacturer holds back and that switch is happening, then they will lose out. And to some extent, that has already happened in the car industry. Tesla took the leap, but they did it when other car manufacturers were reluctant to make the same step towards a fully electric vehicle. And basically, Tesla has forced other manufacturers to commit themselves. Now, the reverse, of course, is unfortunately also true. Every time a hyped startup collapses or an established manufacturer quietly sidelines a project, it undermines rider confidence across the whole sector, and that damages public trust. It makes riders feel that electric motos are something of a toy for the wealthy, or they're even vaporware promises that will never ever arrive. Riders decide, I'll wait and see, but without the early adopters, there's no momentum to push that cycle round. So the battle for electric motorcycles isn't just a technological one, it's a psychological battle too. If confidence builds, adoption snowballs. If it falters, the whole market risks stalling before it even gets going. And it's a vicious cycle until someone steps outside the loop and takes a bit of a chance. As always, can I ask you to take a moment to like and subscribe to this show if you've not already done so? Every click helps other motorcyclists discover my content, or simply share the word the old-fashioned way by telling your riding buddies about Elevenses. They can watch on catch-up. Remember, my latest riding skills articles are always free, and you can get all the links delivered weekly to your email inbox by subscribing to my newsletter at survivalskills.substack.com. Or you can use this QR code to jump straight to it, when the show's over of course. No spam, and if you don't like the content, unsubscribe at any time. Right, okay. After that little interlude, we're back. Now, let's have a look at the startups versus established manufacturers to see what's going on. Now, it probably won't have escaped your attention that there is a clear divide in the electric motorcycle story. To date, startups have dominated the story. We can look at companies like Zero, Energica, Stark, Ultraviolet, the NIO, the Chinese manufacturer. These are the ones that have actually been putting bikes on the road. Many of these are small and underfunded, and they have risked failure, but they innovate. They don't have decades of ICE heritage to protect. For them, the EV is the business model. It's that or nothing, basically. One reason for the dominance of startups with motorcycling is that there are, compared with cars, relatively low barriers to entry. Now, motorcycles are mechanically far simpler than cars to manufacture, so there are significantly lower capital costs to build a prototype. And it's easy to use off-the-shelf components for many of the parts of the bike. You can get those from established suppliers. So what that means is that it's possible for a startup operating with minimal capital to actually create a bike, or at least a prototype, at fairly high speed. And with nothing like the same crash test regulations for motorcycles as there are for cars, it is actually possible to bring a small production run motorcycle to market relatively quickly. Now, small production runs have the advantage that they can actually adapt to technology changes too rapidly. So, what about the big established bike builders? Why aren't there high volume machines appearing from the big manufacturers? Well, entry into the electric motorcycle space has been non existent at worst, slow and cautious at best. Aside from Harley Davidson's Livewire project, which itself was spun off from the parent to keep the risk away from the core brand, we've seen little in the way of commitment. Um, Development projects have come and gone, including the promising electric prototype Triumph's TE1, which they spent a lot of time talking up and then shelved. There's the Ducati Moto E Bike 2, a successful project, but it's not going to be delivering a production motorcycle. There are a few scooters around. Triumph. Honda have a sort of a lightweight plug-in battery drop-in scooter. There's the BMW Maxi scooter. Kawasaki have launched their electric Ninja E1 and the ZE1 street motorcycles. There's also the hybrid Ninja 7 and the Z7. And Honda, of course, have just launched their WN7, which we'll be coming back to. But there's little sense of any urgency amongst these manufacturers to get into this market. Now, publicly, the lack of movement has been repeatedly blamed on a lack of demand, with the companies making statements like riders just aren't asking for electric motorcycles yet. Well, is this true? Is this reluctance a deliberate strategy? Is it really reflecting market conditions? Or is it manufacturers simply not being interested in embracing something new? Well, it's likely there are elements of truth in both sides of that explanation. Now, Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, Suzuki, Ducati, Triumph, BMW, and all the rest, they all have profitable ICE sales and they have loyal customers. And the fact is that if they move early into electric motorcycles, they're simply likely to cannibalize their own sales. It's not going to gain them anything, but it will cost them. Um, and as I said, beyond this, the ICE has been around for over 100 years. It's established technology, and now improvements tend to be incremental rather than game changing. But when it comes to engineering a successful electric motorcycle, which is going to meet the current public perception of what a motorcycle in the broader term should be, there are some complex reasons behind their apparent reluctance. Now, the problem at the moment is combining range and performance with acceptable weight and cost. It's a major engineering hurdle. There have been promises of, you may remember, 200-mile-per-hour electric superbikes, even at 100, a 200 kph superbike with a 200-kilometer range and a 200-kilogram weight. That's seen by some as a sort of golden triangle for electric motorcycle design. Manufacturers haven't yet managed to hit that. So bringing a bike along with acceptable weight and cost is difficult. And then there's the flux in development too. Almost every week there is a new major battery breakthrough story. So there is no certainty about how the powertrain is going to develop. Now, one of these changes, batteries, for example, may finally make it to production, and that could render an entire generation of electric motorcycles obsolete almost overnight. And one change that does seem to be reasonably close is the rapid charging solid state battery that's both lighter and more energy dense. So it would not be so surprising if the established manufacturers who would have to produce, in bulk to make any sense of switching to e-motos, it wouldn't be surprising if they hold back until they're forced to move by regulation, possibly, customer demand, possibly, or this game-changing development in this rapidly developing field, which makes it suddenly worthwhile getting into electric motorcycles. But there is another possible explanation for these companies sort of dragging their heels, and it could be that they are quietly banking on a rollback or a delay of emission regulations. Now, Triumph have shelved that TE1 project. There's no sign of a road-going Ducati. And last year, end of 2023, beginning of 2024, there seemed to be a coordinated pushback as Triumph, BMW, Ducati, and KTM all released statements citing electric vehicle costs, their charging infrastructure problems, the difficulties of making electric motorcycles perform well in extreme conditions, supply chain problems with the batteries and the costs of the rare earth metals, and so on. KTM have themselves said that electric is viable for small bikes, but that e-fuels are the better path for larger, longer range models. Now, back in January 2023, Suzuki laid out a definitive timescale for introducing electric bikes. They announced that their first ever EV motorcycle would be in the small to mid capacity class, and it would be arriving sometime in 2024. And they said they would have a range of 8 by 2030. Well, here we are at the end of 2025, and there's no news from Suzuki about whether anything will appear that is electric anytime in the near future. And possibly this isn't surprising, because at the end of 2023, a further release from Suzuki came out, which somewhat changed the narrative, because they said, quote, that further investment was being directed into alternative sustainable fuels. Now, I've mentioned on Elevenses in the past that the Japanese have been looking deeply into hydrogen as an alternative power source, despite the very obvious issues, which we've also covered in Elevenses, with those as fuel sources. Hedging their bets while sitting on the fence by showing concept bikes. The companies could be seen as talking up the alternatives, but at the same time calling for extensions and exemptions even for two-wheelers, along with this active lobbying for green e-fuels, despite, again, the problems that there will be in producing those in anything like the volume required, and the hydrogen as future saviours of the ICE. Now, they're clearly hoping, I think, that governments will soften ICE bans, because there will be nothing left to ride. And they hope, I think, that the governments will do that before the ICE manufacturers themselves actually have to make hard choices about switching to electric motive power. I don't entirely blame them. So let's look at success and failure. Well, the sad truth is that there so far have been relatively few and far between successful electric motorcycle stories. Some outright failures. Bramo, along with Inertia and ePulse, the company was an early pioneer of electric motorcycles. I remember seeing, I think the AA might have had some of theirs. Anyway, they were chronically underfunded. They were eventually bought by Polaris. They were absorbed into Victory Motorcycles, which itself then got shut down. So proof, if you will, that being first with a product to market doesn't actually guarantee survival. Lightning Motorcycles, there's another interesting one. They promised the world's fastest superbike. They had huge specs for the machine. They set some world records at Bonneville, but production delays, lack of scale, customer service issues means we're actually still waiting to see Lightnings being delivered to customers. Damon Motorcycles, another company with a lot of flashy PR about their radical safety tech. The bike was almost going to ride itself with its AI, and they would also have 200 mile per hour top speed with massive range. They raised huge amounts of investment, but after years of promises, there's still no meaningful production bike. They've become a poster child in some ways for vaporware, and they seem to have transitioned recently to trying to sell their technology rather than the bike. ARC, that's another brand which has been promising big for years, but has delivered just a handful of bikes. Now they too are positioning themselves to sell technology to other companies. Alta, you probably won't even remember that name. I'd forgotten it completely. They showed very promising signs of expanding from a range of successful dirt bikes when they were bought out by Harley Davidson, who then appear not to have used any of the technology. That's a bit of a mystery story. So, what about the brands that are kind of hanging on in there? Well, I've put Zero into this category. They show consistent but limited growth. They have well-reviewed products. I've ridden a couple of Zeros, and I'd happily own one if the range was just a tad longer. But Zero have reportedly yet to turn a profit, and they are supported by equity investment, including funding from Polaris and Hero Motocorp. Harley Davidson and their Livewire brand. Now, they're technically competent machines, but people who've ridden them say they're overpriced, they have poor range, and certainly they have seen slow sales. And they were spun off into that separate brand to protect the brand name of Harley. So they're still alive, but barely kicking, I'd say. What about Can-Am? They launched a couple of high-profile bikes just recently. They suffered the same overpriced, poor range criticism. Fort9 tested the adventure bike and noted that the bike had to go on a trailer to the place where they played with it and then be trailered back because it didn't have the range to ride out of the city to the off-road area. Energica. They are also sort of hanging on in there. They were creating some usable high-end bikes that weren't actually eye-wateringly expensive, and they'd also gained some credibility for providing the bikes for the Moto E racing series. And they actually had a full order book, including a big order from the French police when they collapsed. But their collapse wasn't down to lack of sales, it was more down to lack of cash to fund an upscaling. They'd uh, asked for investment from an equity company, they'd taken a stake in the firm, and then that company itself got into financial difficulties and was unable to fulfill the promised funding. But they have just been rescued by an outfit from Singapore, and they look set to resume production. And then there's Cake. This is the Swedish company, and we'll take a look at what happened to them in just a moment. So, what about the successes? Well, there are some. NIU, I mentioned, they're Chinese and they dominate urban scooter markets. They provide those worldwide. There's e-moto Super Soco. There's Silence. There's Meiving. They all target the economical, low maintenance urban transport solution. They often use removable batteries, which allow home charging where there's no charger to park the bike next to, or they can use battery swap stations in some cases. There's Stark Future. They're a relatively new name, but they've actually managed to turn a profit selling and, more importantly, they're actually delivering large numbers of their off-road competition machines to where noise limits and maintenance costs are actually something of a pain point for owners. Now, the recent news, of course, that they were actually too good and they were being banned from competing against ICE machines can't have hurt their image either. They are reportedly stepping into road machines. And we'll get on there is another question, of course. And then there's Ultraviolet. Now, they are an Indian manufacturer who have produced and, moreover, put on sale the F77 electric sport bike, which actually delivers on many of its claims for performance, range, and the sporty design. So, next, let's have a look at two startup approaches and outcomes. We'll look at Ultraviolet and we'll look at Cake. No, Ultraviolet, the Indian outfit, and Swedish Cake, they actually represent two very different paths towards marketing electric motorcycles. Ultraviolet is an Indian startup. They are backed by TVS Motor Company, who are, of course, a major ICE manufacturer, so they have some serious backing behind them. The F77 Mach 2 is an electric sports bike that launched in the UK in April this year. It's currently priced at £9,399. So not cheap, but not desperately expensive either. Moreover, the bike has delivered on what was claimed for it. Its performance matches the specs. It has a decent range. It has sporty design. And above all, it is a practical two-wheeler. Now, whilst the global market matters, The bulk of the company's sales are likely to go to India's ever-growing middle classes who want aspirational motorcycles, not just cheap 125s and scooters. And this is a critical point. Domestic market demand is huge in India. It's got massive air quality problems in urban areas, um, combined with booming motorcycle sales. And the government incentives are directly supporting EV adoption. Ultraviolet, they're playing sort of the national champion role, if you like, scaling carefully, building credibility locally first before they started looking abroad. So frankly, if nothing untoward happens, if they don't turn out to be underfunded and implode, the future does look bright. Cake is a Swedish brand. It was another startup, but this one, it was founded with a sort of a huge design and PR fanfare, espousing the sort of minimalist Scandinavian aesthetic. But it also came with sort of some heavy corporate branding and built-in partnerships with lifestyle companies. Now, the product was directly aimed at the sort of the design conscious urban buyers in Europe and the US. It was beautifully engineered, but it didn't go very fast. It was aimed at a very niche market. It was touted as a sort of a workhorse for people who wanted to cart their power drills around and power them on site. But it came at a steep price too. The modular format, which was actually clever and allowed the new owner to transform their machine into what they wanted it to do. It was clever, but it was expensive, simply added to the cost. But their marketing strategy, this involved opening multiple outlets overseas, glossy offices in foreign lands. So they opted for this rapid international expansion into the US and Europe long before they actually consolidated anything in the way of bulk sales. And that's when they hit problems, of course. The actual volume of the bikes that they were able to sell didn't match the burn rate from their marketing and expansion policies. And as a result, by 2024, Cake were filing for bankruptcy and restructuring. They built the image of this sort of global lifestyle brand, but they didn't actually sell the bikes to sustain it. Now, Ultraviolet, they're building from a huge domestic base with the support of an established manufacturer. It's a sort of a cautious, it's a credible, it's a grounded approach, if you like. Cake, on the other hand, built a global image before they had global sales. They expanded fast and collapsed just as suddenly. The company has supposedly been rescued, but if products are reaching the market, I haven't heard about it. That's all gone very quiet. So what this shows is that the business model matters as much as the technology side of things. And for emerging markets, success is likely to come from affordability and practicality. So far in the Europe and the US, I'd say the companies have pursued the sort of the image and lifestyle branding, and that has come with the inevitable collapses when the sales haven't materialized. The key point is you can't PR your way into mass adoption without having bikes that back up the PR. So let's have a look at one specific manufacturer, and this is Confederate Motorcycles. You may remember them. They rebranded as Curtis, they switched to electric motorcycles, and they failed. So what happened? Well, Confederate Motorcycles, they had gained a reputation for building exotic, fairly expensive gas-powered bikes, but they were more or less, I believe, successful. And then they changed both name and strategy in early 2018. They were renamed to Curtis. This is after an early sort of American speed pioneer. But they also ditched the ICE engine completely and decided that they would focus on the electric market and, to quote their PR, cool and sophisticated urban mobility. And the company marketed themselves as, quote, the Tesla of motorcycles, saying the focus would be on, quote, luxury, high-end design and unique technology. Now, in 2021, the company was ready to take orders for its first electric motorcycle, the wonderfully named One. Just two problems. It was a six-figure sum, up to 120,000 US dollars, and it had mediocre performance. and that made it poor value for prospective buyers. The result, it didn't sell particularly. Now, rather than securing traditional venture capital, Curtis had gone down the route of publicly seeking investment from individuals to fund their next new model, which was called the Hades. Now, as recently as 2023, the company was still selling on its 120-year heritage. Its quote, entry into the market for the electric motorcycle at a time when there is no market leader nor awareness by any other brand, which is a fairly questionable statement for 2023. And they also claimed, quote, a clear advantage on technology and design, which is also highly questionable. And basically, the Hades was never released. Now, Curtis's failure demonstrates really the risks of abandoning the ICE altogether for a full transition to the electric market. Confederate's history were those sort of big, booming, all-American V-twins, pinning the future on a rebrand, on expensive and unproven technology and a high-risk financial strategy proved to be their undoing. Where are they now? Well, social media accounts, company information was updated as recently as 2023, but that's all gone very quiet. There's no new bikes, no new investment news since then. The website was still active, apparently just a few weeks ago, but only lists the one, and there's no indication of any ongoing business. Right, let's have another quick break. If you enjoy these shows, why not become a member of my Ko-fi pages? Just follow the QR code and sign up. As a member, you get free access to the latest articles and the Survival Schools ebook shop, with instant downloads of everything from free mini ebooks to ebook versions of my paperbacks. Become a one-off supporter and you'll open up the archive of over 1,000 articles. If you buy me a monthly cuppa as a subscriber, there's even more content to enjoy. Right, okay, so let's finish off the show with the last few items I want to talk about. So there's been something of a design arms race between e-moto manufacturers. Curtis, they certainly went overboard on the crazy looks. Go and have a look at their bikes. And I've previously noticed this, that there seems to be a competition for the daftest designs when it comes to electric motorcycles. Few electric motorcycles actually look like, well, a motorcycle. From sort of angular sci-fi concept machines that look more like props from a Marvel film than something you'd actually ride, from technology like hubless wheels with the motors integrated into the rim, from designs that look like cartoon toys rather than practical motorcycles. The designs all seem to want to prioritize novelty over aesthetics. They want to deliver impractical riding positions that look closer to torture devices. Now, arguably, few motorcyclists who see these headline grabbing concepts creating noise in the media actually want a spaceship on two wheels. I would say most of us want rideability, reliability, range, and affordability. Aerodynamics would help too, of course, when every watt of charge spent pushing air out of the way is wasted range. But that seems to be right at the bottom of electric motorcycle designers' briefs. It sometimes feels like startups are trying to outdo each other with shock value rather than actually addressing real rider needs. Okay, so next section then. What about the riders? Are they hostile or are they hesitant? Well, Confederate's failure to rebrand as an electric motorcycle manufacturer, Curtis, it demonstrated the risks of failing to bring your company's fan base with you. Harley Davidson is a brand who bank on their identity. The sound and the character of their combustion engines is central to the Harley experience. So central, they even tried to patent the potato sound some years ago. And that leads directly to the most common rider criticism of the electric motorcycle. And I should include, of course, here that many of the people criticizing electric bikes have never ridden one, but they say they have no soul and no character because they're silent. But, if you think about it, not everyone has loved every ICE sound either. The sharp crackle of the racing two-stroke, beloved of some, hated by others. The scream of the high revving inline four, accelerating down a bypass, the lazy deep thump of a V-twin with straight through pipes. They are all very, very different sounds. Riders argue about which is music and which is noise, and unfortunately many non-motorcyclists see the sound of any motorcycle at all as a reason for banning them. But the fact is that electric motorcycles aren't entirely silent. That's simply a myth. They make a very distinct sound. They make a sort of a whine from the motor, which turns into something of a howl under load. The Zeros, somewhat to my surprise, they deliver a sound rather like a jet turbine engine, sort of spooling up from standstill. It's different, yes, but it's far from non-existent. But beyond that, character isn't just about noise either. People talk about the fact they don't put out much power compared with an ICE, but it's not power that is so important as the torque delivery. Electric motorcycles, they have instant torque and they deliver that very smoothly. But what that means is the bikes are really rapid off the line without having the huge horsepower figures of an ICE engine. For some riders, that itself is an exciting discovery. They really change the way that you feel the motorcycle is accelerating. Weight, yes, that's an issue. It can cause problems with handling when a bike is excessively heavy, but I think the Zeros have actually got it just about right. But anyway, for those who think that an electric motorcycle could never compete with an ICE, Energica, they serve notice by scoring fifth place in an open race against ICE bikes on the Daytona banking back in 2023, and later that year they actually nabbed a podium. And we talked about Stark and their VARG off-road competition machine, which has been banned by at least one off-road race series. So, frankly, when we hear this myth that electric bikes have no soul, it's really just a kind of a lack of awareness of what the electric bikes are about. We do need to adjust our perceptions, yes. But, to enjoy a bike, it doesn't have to be tied to the internal combustion engine. And so to the final point in today's show. And this is a question about Honda's new WN7, which is really what prompted this entire review. Is it a Trojan horse or is it a stalking horse? So what do we know about the WN7? Well, not a great deal yet because Honda haven't released the full spec sheet, but it is their first full-size electric motorcycle and it is destined for Europe. Comes with naked bike styling, 130 kilometers of range, CCS fast charging, and about £13,000 on the road. Now, the big question is this Honda's genuine leap into e-motos, or is it just a way of looking busy? Is it a genuine Trojan horse stealthily penetrating a new market, or is it a stalking horse, a sort of token prototype, a one-off really, dressed up to look like a real motorcycle, when the actual genuine strategy behind this is to keep the ICE alive until governments blink and extend the life of the ICE? Let's look at the case for both sides. Now, first, and on one hand, of course, this is Honda we're talking about, the largest Japanese manufacturer, the company which has become something of a byword for quality products. Honda has the experience, they have the dealers, they have the supply chain, and they have promised a range of e-motorcycles, although they're not going to hit their promised end of 2025 target. And by starting with this, what they call a fun naked bike, it could be seen as a way to sort of build that supply chain and customer confidence without going high profile and radically disrupting their existing ICE business model. Now, second, this is a proper motorcycle. It's not a scooter. It's not just a low-powered commuter like the Kawasaki. It does have some decent specs too. It gets fast charging out of the box. It gets the trademark electric motor torque. Honda say it's similar to that of a 1000cc engine. And the bike is, at least for an electric motorcycle, of a reasonable weight and size. Third, it is a product that you should be able to buy by walking into a showroom. You're not going to be parting with cash as a down payment as via crowdfunding towards a machine which you never actually get delivered to you. Now, along with Kawasaki's pair of bikes, the WN7 could, if this is the true case of things, it could just be the bridge bike that makes electric motorcycles feel mainstream and not just something produced by startups. On the other hand, is it a case of Honda doing just enough to look like they're doing something? Is it a PR move to tick the EV box? Is it a wait and see test bed with conservative specs to see who jumps to pick it up? Now, you could point to the 130-kilometer range. It might be okay for a commuter, but it's pretty laughable for serious riding or certainly touring. It's not as outrageous as some in terms of looks, but it's not gorgeous either. 217 kilograms, 478 pounds. It's heavier than many ICE bikes, although not overly heavy in terms of some of the higher performance electric bikes. With the fixed battery, of course, there's no swapping, but it does get the fast charger. But you still rely on charging infrastructure, which is still, in its infancy across much of the UK and Europe. So the range anxiety of owning one is still there. Now, second, whilst £12,999 is not premium pricing, it's not slotting in side by side with a comparable performance ICE motorcycle either. So this isn't opening up the market so much as testing it. And some UK dealers have already stated that they will not be stocking it in their showrooms. Although you can walk in and buy one, you can't go in and sit on one. It'll be available on an order-only basis. Now, third, it appears that sales are currently limited to Europe, where there is, of course, a clear date for the end of the ICE motorcycle on the calendar. Global availability, that's still uncertain. Honda have not yet confirmed whether the motorcycle will be sold into other markets such as the United States, Australasia, or Asia. Now, either way, I see the WN7 as something of a litmus test. Honda has the resources to succeed for sure, but converting petrol heads overnight is mission impossible for sure, equally for sure. And of course, the critics are already lining up to argue it's short on appeal. If you recall, I mentioned the Kawasaki, the electric sort of 125 equivalent, and the hybrid. Those bikes are currently up for grabs at huge discounts, which is clearly not what Kawasaki was hoping for. Will that be the fate of the WN7 2 years from now? I like to think it won't, and maybe that's why it's order only. But I do fear that it might be. And if Honda can't get this right after years of waiting for others to test the water first, who will? Right, so let's wrap up then. Well, ultimately, the electric motorcycle industry in 2025 is a tale of contradictions. It's booming in some markets, it's struggling in others. Some types of bikes are selling well, and there are manufacturers like Royal Enfield investing in their flying flea, and there are others where companies are seriously talking down the prospects for electric motos. Startups are crashing and burning, established companies moving cautiously. There's incredible tech on the horizon, but there are frustrating realities at the moment. I don't think the question is whether electric motorcycles will succeed, but how they'll succeed and how soon. Now, for the time being, I think until a new generation of riders who have fewer preconceptions about the superiority of the ICE arrive on the scene, I honestly am beginning to think that the e-moto will remain a niche for all but commuters. But I believe that transition is coming at some point in the not too distant future, but we're just not seeing it yet. Right. Okay. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that insight. As I say, I'm saying this as a sort of an enthusiastic rider rather than an industry insider. So if you know any better, I'm more than happy to be corrected. Do drop me a line. But before I go, don't forget that it is your help that keeps me producing these shows. So I just want to give a quick shout out to last week's supporters and subscribers over on my coffee page. Clive, Paul, Peter, he's a fresh subscriber, by the way, Don Crokin, Brian, Christine, Ian R, clear and anonymous. So thanks mightily for your support. And I'm also going to add thanks to everybody who bought my paperbacks in the last few weeks too. I don't have names for those because it's all handled by my printer, but thank you once again. So if you want to join them and show your support, then head over to my Ko-fi page and join me over there. Right, so that's it for today. Thanks for everybody who's looked in. As I said, this is a recorded show, so all that's going out at 11 o'clock. Whether you're watching it at 11 or on catch-ups, you have been watching Elevenses. I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training, and make a date to join me for the next show for another roundup when we'll get back to the more regular news, views, and biking tips. And if you are out there on your bike this morning enjoying the ride, do make sure you stay shiny side up, and then I'll see you next time.